Thank you for all coming. Welcome. Another week, another 2 weeks. Maybe we're getting towards the end. I hate to say that, and I hate to, as they say, left liftoch pele satan, open the mouth to the devil. But um, maybe we'll reaching towards the end, and then we'll just have monthly meetings instead of every other week, and I can stop putting out Saturday night updates. Um, it's looking good, but there's no way of knowing whether there was really going to be an agreement at this point. I'm talking now about the hostage deal and negotiations for a ceasefire. It's looking good from a number of different perspectives. Number one, it's been reported that Netanyahu and Smotrich had a screaming meeting last night where Netanyahu basically tried to tell Smotrich that things are more important than resettling Gaza, because that's what the Smotrich wants to do, is resettle Gaza. There's no support in this country for that, and of course, that's not never was on Netanyahu's agenda. Number two, it seems that that meeting took place after Trump's envoy flew into Tel Aviv just to meet, just for the purpose of meeting Netanyahu. And basically, from all we can tell, reading him the Riot Act, that he better get an agreement before Trump gets office. Now, Netanyahu is hoping for all these things from Trump, including his most important thing, which is Iran, which we'll get to in a minute, whether it's likely or not. But in any case, Trump he's afraid of. Biden he wasn't really afraid of. The other reason he's afraid of Trump and not Biden is with Trump in office, he has no one to play off. In other words, when Biden was in office and Democrats were in office, he could always play off the Democratic president with the Republican Congress, which is what he was really good at. But with a Republican president and a Republican Congress, it'll be very hard for Netanyahu to do anything to push back against Trump if he feels he needs to. So he is now, it seems, committed to making an agreement. And the other times he really wasn't committed to making an agreement. Each time he did things that made it more difficult to nearly impossible. Now, the other factor, of course, is the Israeli public is ready for an agreement, and not only because it's ready to get the hostages back, which they've been ready for a long time, but the reality of the fighting on the ground in Gaza is such that no one wants to continue it. This is beginning to remind everybody of what things were like in Lebanon before 2000 when we pulled out of Lebanon, except worse. The more soldiers, the 50 soldiers died since October in northern Gaza, going through places that to some extent were already conquered before. This work that we're doing is very intensive, but as soon as you put troops into places that you think you control, but you don't always control, and you don't really control, go speak to the Americans who went to Vietnam, speak to the Americans in Iraq. You're fighting a guerrilla warfare on someone else's territory. Very, very difficult to avoid casualties. Of course, you can win it. I mean, clearly the IDF can win it and can beat the Hamas at any given time, but it can't do it without casualties. Yesterday's attack was an example of being too sure of oneself, believing that we had already cleared the area that the Hummer went on. There was no real great danger, and you set in a non-armored Hummer to transfer people into the combat zone. Non-armored Hummers, the end result is what we saw yesterday. There's a limit. That's people don't seem to understand. There's a limit to how many troops we have. There's a limit to how many vehicles we have. We don't have enough armored personnel carriers. We don't have enough tanks to meet all the needs that we've had in this war, and we don't have enough armaments. Someone asked today, we're going building by building and blowing it up, and someone asked, well, why can't we just bomb them instead, like we did in some cases in Lebanon, tell everyone to get out and just bomb it. And of course, there are two parts to the reason for that. Number one, we don't have enough bombs. I mean, not that we don't have no bombs left, but we can't afford to use all of our bombs on blowing up buildings when we need those bombs possibly for the Houthis, possibly for Iran, possibly for other targets. We just don't have enough bombs. And number two, the bombs work really well in taking down buildings. They don't work so well in getting underground tunnels, as we've seen. The bombing that we did prior to this of the war to tunnels was basically ineffective. Um, and so, and there's still plenty of tunnels in the areas in Beit Hanun where we think we have cleared out. So ending the war is also an objective for the good of the army, for the good of our soldiers, who at this point, it's not totally clear, what they're dying from, other than we have to keep the war going under pressure in order to get an agreement to get the hostages out. And we can't just end the war because we need to end the war with an agreement. Now, all along, Netanyahu has not been willing to do it because he's afraid that Ben Gvir and Smotrich will walk out of his government and bring him down. Two things have changed related to that. On one hand, although he hasn't been willing to accept it, he has gotten multiple offers from the opposition of various kind, even from the Ram Arab Party, saying they will support a new government without the two of them through the next election to make sure his government doesn't fall. I think number two, the successes that we've had in the war, primarily in terms of Lebanon and Hezbollah and all those things, make it much easier for us now to reach an agreement and say we've won the war, as opposed to, give up and leave Gaza with Hamas in control and give up lots of prisoners, which is what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to give up lots of prisoners. Now, Smotrich's party and Ben Gvir's party oppose releasing prisoners at all in return for hostages. They're in the minority in the country, in the extreme minority, actually, because everyone understood that the cost of getting hostages back is releasing Palestinian prisoners. But the big question is, will they actually withdraw from the government, or will they just vote against it? Political observers right now are claiming they're just going to vote against it. They won't withdraw from the government. I don't know. I am not someone who accepts the opinions of certain political observers, including those who think that they're definitely not going to withdraw from the government. We'll have to see. Ben Gvir has been semi-withdrawing from the government in any case over the last 2 weeks in various protests, and hasn't been voting with the government on the budget and on other things. So I think to some extent, his not being part of the government has already been taken into account. And on top of everything else, there's no question that Netanyahu's health is, I think, pushing him to an agreement as well. His situation is probably worse than, I mean, I'm not saying he's dying or anything like that, but the situation is worse than was, of course, originally said. Originally said he was going to get laparoscopic surgery. He clearly didn't have laparoscopy. He was opened up for the surgery. It's taken him longer to recover. So, and he's not a young man. Politicians, I really believe that certainly it goes for the United States, and it goes for Israel, and it goes for everyone else in the world, that chief executives of corporations shouldn't be more than 75 years old. You can be in Congress, or you can be in the Knesset until you're 80, let's say. And even then, I think at 80, it's time, we don't need, in America, don't need 85-year-old congressmen and senators. And even though a lot of us on this call are getting up there in the years, I think 80, 85 is a little bit old to be a congressman. And I think anything above 75 is a little bit old to be president, or it's a little bit old to be prime minister of Israel as well. So that's something that, not only Israel, but the United States, I think, needs to come to grips with. Whether you're a vigorous 78 or you're a less vigorous 78, and one beat the other, but ineffectively. But I think it's not healthy for anybody to have people of those ages being those type of positions. And again, here in Israel as well, we have the same situation. So we're at that point at the moment. We don't know. We don't really know what Hamas's position is, and there's a big question. We're negotiating with what's called the Hamas that's in Doha. What impact and what control they have over Hamas in Gaza, we do not know. Ikhwa Sinwar's brother is the one in charge. He is supposedly more crazy and more extreme than Sinwar, who we killed, was, but we just don't know. And we don't know, what they're willing to agree to, what they're willing to actually give in on. Are they willing to go ahead with this agreement? The sense is yes, but the sense is one thing. The reality we'll have to find out in the next day or two. And again, until now, I do believe it's mostly been Netanyahu who's um, who's made it sure we didn't have an agreement, specifically because he wasn't willing to end the war and talking about ending the war. At this point, he understands that ending the war is good for Israel as well. At this point, it may not be good for his political situation, but maybe he's come to the conclusion that it won't be so bad for him politically. I don't really know the answer to that question. But the current situation is certainly not helping him, and it's certainly not helping Israel in any serious way. To keep fighting the way we've been fighting, um, time will tell, to be quite honest. In the meantime, the ceasefire has held in the north. I think it's more than holding in the sense that events are happening in Lebanon that could have far-reaching consequences. The fact that they have a president of Lebanon right now, that he has committed himself to ensuring the fact that the Lebanese army is the only people with guns in the country, could be a major, major event. Can he impose it? Can he make it happen? I think it's really possible because Hezbollah is not, right now caught without any source of arms. Now that the Syrian government has made it very clear that they're not going to allow Hezbollah to be rearmed via Syria, Iran has no good way of getting arms to Hezbollah. They can't fly them in because the government won't allow it to be distributed from the airport. And if, we will also try to stop it. They certainly can't bring it in by sea because we have a semi-sea blockade over Lebanon. Not one that cuts off all commerce, but one that would certainly intercept any sort of armaments coming from Iran that I'm sure we can track together with the help of the United States. So, um, so Hezbollah really is in a pickle at this point. What we need to be is someone to fund the Lebanese government in such a way that it can start paying its soldiers more than the Hezbollah pays its soldiers. From what I understand, there's a large delegation of Saudis arriving in Lebanon tomorrow. The natural evolution of these things would be for Saudi Arabia to become the major donor of Lebanon, taking over from Iran. And of course, the Saudis have more than enough money, and of course, they can push the Sunnis and they can support particularly the Sunnis and the Druze and the Christians that are left in Lebanon against the Shiites. And some of the Shiites might decide that they'd rather be moderate than move away from Hezbollah. So that would be the way to go, and I think there's signs of that happening. If it happens, it could be a major strategic change. It already is partly a strategic change. And if somehow we can get our act together and do the steps needed to move forward with relations with Saudi Arabia after this war ends, then we could also reach peace with Lebanon. I can remember when I first moved to Israel, which was almost 50 years ago, the talk was always Lebanon would be the second country to make peace with Israel. That ended, by the late 70s, that was no longer the case. But they were going to be the second country because we had good relations and no issues. That changed when the PLO moved to Lebanon and then when the Hezbollah became a major factor. But we can go back to that. And of course, the Israeli dream is to open up that railroad tunnel in Rosh Nikra and run those trains back up to Beirut and then from Lebanon up north, and so we can, a land bridge to Europe. That's every Israeli's dream, so we don't have to depend on El Al to get in and out of the country. So I don't expect it to happen, but it's in the near term. But let's put it this way, I think it's more likely to happen than it is for us to reach real peace with the Palestinians. It's in a lot of people's interest, and so interests sometimes determine what happens. And I'm slightly optimistic that might happen. I'm also remain optimistic about Syria, despite all the warnings. So far, all the actions that the new government has taken have been positive. They made it very clear that I'm interested in the confrontation with Israel. They made it very clear that they have renounced extremism. They arrested some ISIS people the other day. Of course, they made it very clear that their enemy number one is Iran. Since our enemy number one is Iran, their enemy number one is Iran. So therefore, the logic is that since we share an enemy, we can also share friendship. Maybe. I wouldn't rush again the old saying of getting hummus in Damascus, but I think we need to we need to play this a little bit smarter and play this as if there's a chance for really reaching a reconciliation with the this government. In some ways, the fact that we took all of this land from them is probably good because now we can give it back and it can be a major gesture. And we can avoid dealing with the rest of the issue being the Golan Heights for some other day, some other time. So I'm somewhat optimistic about that. Yemen. I'm happy to say that we've slept through the night now for, I think it's 8 nights, 7 or 8 nights. I don't want to, again, liftach Pele Satan, and every night, we say tonight will be the night they'll come visiting us again with another rocket, excuse me, missile, not a rocket. But so far, so good. So far, I think the combined attacks, primarily by the coalition, because they've been attacking every second day or so, and every once in a while by us, is having its effect. The coalition, of course, has an easy way of attacking. U.S. has an aircraft carrier off the coast, not that far. For them, it's just a sortie. For us, it's a whole big deal with refueling on the way back, and everything else. But it's within our range. We also need some American refueling tankers that I think could do in 2 years. It took a while for the U.S. to approve the sale. It was approved by the Biden administration sometime before the war. But to those of you who've been following the news of Boeing, know that Boeing is way behind schedule on everything these days. That includes our tankers. So, um, the tankers we're using still fly, but as I mentioned last night in the update, I flew on them as a passenger when I was in reserve duty and had to get back for the birth of my daughter, and that was 43 years ago. They were flying them as the Air Force was flying those as passenger planes, and they were old planes back then. The Air Force took over some old LL or other 707s that were 20 years old when the Air Force took them over, and or 15 years old when the Air Force took them over, and are still flying now, all these years later, flying as tanker aircraft. Like I said, the new tanker aircraft are on order from Boeing, but I'm not sure when they're going to get here. I think it's 2 years out, if I'm not mistaken. So we're able to hit the Houthis. The Americans have been hitting the Houthis. The British and some other countries as well have participated. I assume we're getting better and better intelligence. Both we're putting an effort in it, the US is putting an effort in it, and of course, I assume everybody's ally in all this is the Saudis. The Saudis were fighting the Houthis until the Americans stopped the Saudis from fighting them. The human rights organizations were all upset that the poor people in Yemen were starving. People are starving all the time. As far as the human rights organizations, they forced Saudi Arabia to stop its attack on the Houthis, or I should say, they forced America to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop its attacks on the Houthis. Obviously, that may have been a mistake. The Houthis seem to be a rather unique group of people who who are better not allowed to get too far, and um, hopefully the attacks are working and will continue to work, but we just don't know. They're probably the only Iranian proxy that's still in the game, other than to some extent the Iraqi Shiite militias, but they've stopped firing upon us because we threatened them and the US threatened them. And between the two of us, we could do some significant harm to them. So the Iraqi Shiites have stopped firing at us, so it just leaves the Houthis in Taiman. The big question here keeps on being, should we attack Iran or not? This is an opportunity. We shouldn't. Two things are clear. We're clearly not going to do anything before Trump, gets into power. We're clearly going to see which way Trump is planning to go vis-a-vis Iran, and no one really knows. Um, he has they tried to kill him theoretically, which doesn't tend to make him very happy about people. On the other hand, he likes making deals. He may try to make a deal with the Iranians. The Iranian economy is the worst it's been in a long, long time. Additional sanctions and other actions could really push it over. I don't know. I'm a strong believer in regime change and not trying to take out the nuclear facilities because taking out the nuclear facilities is a short-term gain. Regime change is a long-term gain. But U.S. hasn't been particularly good at it, although it was very successful in 1953 in Iran. But 53 is a long time ago. So um, whether the U.S. still has those skills, I don't know. Whether we have those skills, I don't know. But obviously, the best thing that can happen for us and for the Middle East is for Iran to be regime change in Iran. Like I said, I don't know whether we'll get it or not. I don't know whether we're really working on it. So that's where we stand in terms of Iran, and that's basically where we stand in terms of the war at this point. There's still warfare going on in Gaza. There's still soldiers dying in Gaza. And of course, well, I should mention the West Bank. It continues to be terror attacks, and we continue to have actions inside of the West Bank at various points. Um, but that's been going on for years. There's nothing new about that. It's been going on since the first Intifada. So we're talking about something that's been going on and off now for 45 years. So I don't expect that to change drastically. They talk about the fact that Iran is trying to get armaments to them and to try to get them to take action. Again, Iran is not that close by. One of the means of getting arms was via Syria, Syria and the corner of Jordan. That no longer is available to them. So it's not clear how much Iran can do anything. Okay, that's all on the foreign side. The big domestic issue is going to be this week. It is the issue of ultra-Orthodox draft. The government is supposedly putting forth its proposal to the Knesset this week, or at least the essence of its proposal, and if not the proposal itself. It's not clear whether an agreement of any kind has been made. Most people are skeptical that an agreement can be reached. The basic needs of both parties, being the ultra-Orthodox and the rest of the country, are at odds with each other. The ultra-Orthodox want none of their children to have to serve, and everybody else wants all of their children to be able to serve. Can we reach an agreement where half of them serve or something like that? They're pretty adamant about it. They see um, or claim that when their soldiers go into the army, they come back less religious. Well, first of all, they're right in a certain way, not because they're in a not religious environment, but you take any 18-year-old or 19-year-old who's been living in a cocoon for his whole life, and you've taken him even a little bit outside that cocoon, he is likely to see the world in a little different sort of way. And that's what happens with some of the ultra-Orthodox going to the army, even though they're limited in their interaction with the rest of the army. There is some interaction, and they have some access to things they didn't have access to. And so some small percentage of them change their views. They don't become non-religious in most cases, but they might become a little less religious or a little less ultra-Orthodox. They just remain Orthodox or whatever. Look, the whole basis of the ultra-Orthodox society is the ghetto. And the way they maintain their membership is to keep them uh, in their embrace and in such a way that they have as little as possible interaction with the outside world. And if they have as little of interaction as possible with the outside world, they stay inside the little worlds. And of course, once they get married and all that gets into a continuous cycle. But we do see some are leaving, and there have always been some leaving, more than we've thought. And it's something we need to encourage. Because the problem of the ultra-Orthodox not only not drafting is only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is them not being part of the economy and the fact that every Israeli supports them in one way or another. And so, if they were a small little minority of, 10, 20,000, that's fine. We can afford that, but it's not. We're talking about a million probably at this point, and the number is only going to increase with time as their birth rate is twice that of the average Israeli birth rate. So we'll see how that works out. We've been talking about this issue for many, many years. We haven't been able to resolve it. It goes back to the pre-state years. It really goes back to the pre-state years. It goes back to Ben Gurion making certain promises to the ultra-Orthodox that they wouldn't oppose statehood in the period of time of the United Nations partition plan. And he made certain promises for what we quote unquote the status quo, and we've all been paying for it since. He also was not willing, Ben Gurion, to take on the ultra-Orthodox when it came to a constitution, which is what we needed in 1948. We did not get one, and we're paying for that price right now. We'll have to see what develops. I mentioned the other day on the issue of judicial reform slash a proposal that was put forth as a compromise. It was a compromise between two people in the government. On the other hand, some people oppose it strongly. I'm almost willing to go along with it, even though I think there are problems with it. One of the interesting factors where I disagree, and I'll write a little about this evening, is there is this sense of, their this new plan that they have, without going into too much details, makes the opinion of the judges and lawyers less sacrosanct, and that's taking away the expertise from the decision to appoint judges. Well, I've always thought the Israeli judicial system stunk, not for the reasons they wanted to make reform, and not for the reasons they had too much power over the government. That it didn't have enough power. But the overall judicial system in this country, I've always thought, I can go back to even when I was a teenager arguing with a close Israeli friend at the time whose father was a leading lawyer. And he was saying how the Israeli system is the best system in the world. And I back then, before I had any real involvement in the system, thought it was a terrible system. And my few encounters with the system proved to me it's a terrible system. The fact that a judge makes all the decisions, there's no jury, that's one part of it. But the fact that the judge is dealing with 50 cases at the same time, that's not consecutive. I don't think it's possible for justice really to occur when one judge is the judge on the jury, as opposed in the American system, and is simultaneously hearing 50 cases. I'm exaggerating maybe a little bit, but by not much. And I don't think that system actually works. And in fact, our system doesn't really work. So to say that we have to give all the power to these experts who are part of the system to decide who the next judges are, I'm a little more reluctant to say that that's an absolute. I agree with some of the people that the government wants to put are extremists, but I'm also not willing to say that certain changes don't have to be made. And if we can come up with a deal where we accept this plan with a few minor modifications, and the rest of the judicial quote unquote reform goes back to something else, I think that would be the best. We'll have to see what happens with that. Okay, we're at the halfway point. Time for questions. If people have questions, raise your virtual hands, and I or my wife might see you and tell me to call on you. And I just lost. Oh, there we go. Michael.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
There's a very bizarre report in the Jerusalem Post today about Iran giving drones, uh, in a most unusual way. What do you think of that in
I didn't see the
Syria?
report. What way were they giving drones?
All right.
Okay. Anyone else?
Go to somebody else.
No one else has questions? I know.
I have a question, Mark.
Go ahead.
Are there any concerns about Turkey getting involved in Syria in a way that negatively would affect Israel?
There's a concern about it. As a matter of fact, the policy that was put forth, policy paper about for the future of the armed forces, took that into account. So there is a concern that might be an issue in going forward in the future. I don't know. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens going forward. I don't think so in the end. In the end, first of all, I'm not quite sure how much longer how much longer Erdogan will be in power. I mean, not that he's going to go to power anytime soon, but he's not popular anymore in Turkey. Um, I think we'll have to see. I don't see us going to war with Turkey. Let's be honest. They're a NATO member. The U.S. could cut off their arms. I don't see that happening. Ultimately, we're excellent trading partners. It's hurting both the countries right now not to be trading. So I think that once this war is over, things will go back to some sense of normalcy, but we'll have to see. I see that my grandson has a question via my daughter. Um, so Avidan says he has a question. I don't know. Let's see. Do we?
That's not
Sorry,
relevant.
I found out the answer. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
That they want to give drones to the American-backed Kurds, Iran, 1,500 drones.
Okay, well, it goes back, my enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Kurds are theoretically fighting the Syrian government and the Turks. So there's a certain strange logic in that. But it's a strange logic. Keep in mind that the Ukrainians are the ones who gave drones, theoretically, they said, to the rebels who took over the country. So, you know, also we're major suppliers of the Kurds. So it's quite interesting. But like I said, enemies of enemies are friends. We'll have to see.
We could end up with being friends with Iran.
We could, but I don't see that happening. Well, let's rephrase that. As long as the Ayatollahs are in control there, that won't happen. The minute they're gone, we'll become good friends with them once again. We were once good friends, and we can become good friends once again. Okay, back
Mark,
to
it's Harvey,
Howard.
Harvey Braunstein. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Does Israel have any plan whatsoever to flood the tunnels?
No, the tunnels failed. So it was in the right. We had a plan. It failed to work. So there's no plan to flood any tunnels. On top of which, there are clearly hostages down whatever's left of the tunnels. That makes no sense at this point.
Well, but there's a future.
There's a future. They also learned how to put doors in the tunnels. So like they have in submarines. It failed the first time. So there's no reason to think it would work a second time. Maybe it's got a different plan. I don't know. Howard Waff.
Hi, it's Janet.
Janet. Hi, Janet.
Hi. Unless I'm misinformed or don't know the whole story, which I'm sure I don't, the religious people are not educated the way I think about education.
Ultra Orthodox. So don't say the religious people.
Yes.
The ultra Orthodox.
Okay,
Ultra-Orthodox.
ultra-Orthodox.
Okay.
And so they don't have the same ciphering, reading, critical thinking skills. What kind of jobs? Why would they be trusted as soldiers?
Okay. So
What kind of jobs would?
Okay. Well, let's step back a second.
Okay.
They are not. They are not taught the same things that you would like your children to be taught, or your grandchildren, or whatever it might be. They're not taught civics. They're not taught literature. They're not taught all sorts of things, history. There are lots of things they're not taught. But they're not uneducated in the sense that they learn to read. They learn to read Chumash. They learn to interpret Talmud. They're not stupid. They learn critical thinking skills when it comes to Talmud and other sort of things. They may not be the skills that I would like my children or grandchildren to have, but they do learn critical thinking skills. So there is no reason to think that if you were to train them to be, and the fact of the matter is, those that have been trained, the numbers that have gone in, they've been fine soldiers. You don't. They're not about to become high-level technicians in certain areas, but the reality is some of them have actually gone on to be people in specialized units, and you'd be surprised the connection between studying Talmud and computer programming, for the sake of argument.
Okay.
In the same way there's a connection between computer programmers and music. There are all sorts of connections that the brain makes. So as much as, look, I want these people to get basic education for two reasons. One is I want them out of the ghetto. I mean, I don't want these people to stay in the ghetto having kids. I think it's bad for the country, etc. We'll leave that part aside. I want them to have skills that are good for the workplace. But if you want to ask me a good question, do I know what the right skills of the workplace is going to be for 5 years, 5 more years into the era? I don't know what the skills that people are going to want to need and what they should have. I want them to be educated, but do I know what the right skills are at this point? I clearly don't. So we'll
All
see.
right, then I stand corrected. Thank you.
Okay. Is there something for Avidan yet before I go to anyone else?
Avidan had a question about something regarding the weather and ice and salt, not about this. But also,
Okay.
just to build on what you said, how smart are any 18-year-old, no matter what school they went to? You see all
No.
these dumb college kids doing stupid things, and those are the same kids who are in the Israeli army.
Yeah,
So
there's no question. Look,
probably the yeshiva educated ones are more serious and smarter than the random ones who've been partying through high school and getting ready to.
Right. I mean, we don't know. Look,
Yeah.
18, look, as we all know, all studies show that the human brain is still evolving until it's 25. So 18-year-olds are not on the other hand, 18-year-olds have always been the ones that have gone to battle because we can convince them to go to battle because their brains are not all the way there and they don't have the same concerns that a 25-year-old has. So armies throughout the world have always used 18-year-olds. Also, in terms of physical strength, you're probably at your best in physical strength between the ages of 18 and 20, and armies want people at the best in physical strength. So that's why they're the ones in the army. But do they have the best, skills to make decisions? Well, guess what? By the time they become serious officers, they're a little bit older. The U.S. Army officers come out of West Point and the Naval Academy, etc., and they don't begin to graduate until 22. And so you have 22-year-olds in America as officers, and which are a bit older. And after 4 years of preparation in an army, like I said, West Point, Naval Academy, Air Force Academy, etc. So they're older and more experienced by the time they become officers, and they're only junior officers when they get out. So no 18-year-old is all the way there. And like I said, the yeshiva students, the only problem I would say, the bigger problem probably the yeshiva students is they're probably not in the best of physical shape. So they don't spend time outside running and doing things that most teenagers do. And so that can be a bit of a challenge, but that can be overcome with training. It's not something, that's not something that can't be overcome. So, Alan Krim.
Hello. My question relates to the situation in Jordan, and will the new government in Syria be a benefit in terms of less pressure on Jordan, with some of the refugee population moving back out of Jordan, creating less pressure within Jordan for overpopulation and economic burden?
I don't have the answer to that question. The general thought is yes. Question is, one of the big questions we don't know is how fast people are going to want to go back to Syria, and how how good their lives have been in new places. I understand from someone who travels to Jordan that the Syrian refugees in Jordan have done a great job of creating a bunch of Syrian restaurants, and the place to get the best Syrian hummus is in Amman right now. So I don't know if I haven't been to Amman firsthand, but someone who I sort of know who reported about it said that the best, they did a really good job setting up restaurants in Amman. So, if you have a nice, successful restaurant in Amman, you're going to want to move back to Damascus right now. So we don't know these questions. The same problem exists in Europe, right? In other words, Europeans would love for all the Syrian refugees to return to Syria. But does the Syrian refugee living in Germany want to return to Syria? Or is he much happier in Germany right now? And so, refugees are refugees until they become immigrants, and immigrants become citizens, and citizens want to stay where they are. So I think it's a question of time. What this does do is it stops the push for more. In other words, there's no reason for anyone to accept any Syrian refugees. The people who are going to push them all out will be Turkey. Turkey will physically push all the Syrian refugees back into Syria because Turkey can do that and get away with it. So I'll have to see. Marcy.
Hi, it's actually Albert and Marcy, Albert Fialco here in
Okay.
Calgary, Alberta, Canada.
Okay, it's early in the morning.
So, morning. We live in a Meshuggah world where everyone wants rights, but no one wants to accept responsibility. And you see it everywhere. Now, I'm wondering, the Orthodox certainly want their rights respected, and I can appreciate that. But how do they contribute, the ultra Orthodox, excuse me, but how do they contribute to Israel? All right, and is their perspective sustainable in Israel, economically, politically, and with regard to Israel's actual survival? Because as I understand it, the troops are exhausted and they need relief, and there isn't the population to maintain Israel's security.
Okay, so let's divide that into two. How do they justify it themselves? Well, they think that their prayers and their studying are what saves the country. And as much as that seems absurd to most of us, they do believe it. They absolutely positively believe it. These yeshiva students are absolutely convinced that because they're studying Talmud, that's what's saving the country. So,
can I respond to that? Because there's a tremendous joke to that. There's the guy who's the flood is occurring, and he says, "I believe in God. God will save me." And a truck comes to pick up the guy off the roof, and he says, "No, it's okay. God will save me." A boat comes to pick the guy off the roof. He says, "No, God will save me." A helicopter finally comes to pluck him off the roof, and he says, "No, God will save me." Of course, he gets flooded, he gets drowned, he dies, he goes to heaven, he goes, "God, what? What happened? I believed in you. How could you not save me?" He says, "Well, I sent the truck, I sent the boat, I sent the helicopter. What else can I do?"
Right. Well, but that's that. But you've got both sides of that. Your answer is, of course, it doesn't work. But the reality is, they believe it. They believe it. Now, it's self-justifying. Look, based on the Jewish sources that I'm familiar with, it's an absurdity because it says quite clearly that even someone at his wedding, if it's a milchemet, a war of necessity, which certainly this war certainly started as a war of necessity, needs to leave his bridegroom at the altar to go fight a war of necessity. So where studying Talmud sits on that level, it just doesn't fit. Obviously, by all reasonable viewpoints, all these people should have been in the army first and foremost, ahead of everybody else, because certainly in a war of necessity, they should be fighting it because that's what it says in the Torah about, what people should do. However, it's very easy to self-justify, going to the army, especially if you've had no experience with it, is a scary thing. A lot of these Haredim, the ones who finally decide to do it, are scared out of their minds. They don't grow up. Look, the average Israeli grows up in a world where everyone around him has gone into the army. If he's the youngest in a family, his brothers and his sisters have all gone into the army. Even if he's the oldest, his cousins have gone into the army. His father's gone into the army. Father may still be doing reserve duty. It's all very, very, very clear to them what the army service is, and they're not. They're not. I mean, everyone's afraid a little bit of going to the army. We're all afraid when going to the army the first time. Not so much afraid of living and dying, but you're giving up a certain amount of freedom, everything else. Go to basic training. No basic training is ever a pleasant experience. But it's part of what you do when you go into an army to defend the country. They don't want to. They want to live in their little bubbles, and they have rabbis who maintain control by doing that. They believe very strongly that their goal in life is to maintain their flocks. To maintain their flocks, they must maintain them inside their own little bubbles. I was reading a book today that I'll review, talking about one of the reasons we don't have a constitution, and actually talking about how the rabbis back then, the head of Agud Yisrael knows the rabbis from then opposed strongly the creating of a law that created a Supreme Court in this country, because they didn't think there should be a Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is the Torah. And so when you have those perspectives, it's really, they want their world and their little world to live in. And even their little world should have been proven that during, what happened during the Holocaust, to their worlds of yeshivas and everything else is not sustainable without protection. History doesn't seem to have any impact, and they believe in their world. And problem is the rest of the Israeli population. We need people, and second of all, it just can't be that they're the only group that the children don't go into the army and don't die. I see a question here. Is Israel's rather warm criticism toward Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine had the same benefits for Israel and Syria had become mysteriously quiet at critical times? Okay, so interesting. I have in today's update the article that I wrote about a month into the Ukraine war, when I came out 100% against the Israeli position. I thought Israel should be supporting Ukraine. I'm a strong believer that Russia is evil when it comes to Ukraine. When it comes to a lot of things, and I thought Israel should have been on the side of Ukraine. Now, back then, there were two main reasons given for why we weren't supporting Ukraine. Number one, we were concerned about Russian anti-aircraft systems in Syria that would limit our abilities to act. And two, the issue of the Jews that were left in Russia. As to the first one, I claimed back then, and I think we saw it in Iran, but going back historically, Russian anti-aircraft systems have never been much of a threat for the Israeli Air Force. I mean, they have to be dealt with, but Israel's Air Force has always known how to deal with, well, I won't say always. During the opening period of the Yom Kippur War, we were taken by surprise and we weren't ready. But after the Yom Kippur War, since then, it's been a priority of the Israeli Air Force to know how to deal with Russian-made anti-aircraft systems, and we've done a good job of doing that throughout time. So I didn't think that was really valid. Although, what the person asked, I think I mentioned the other day, the Iranians claimed that the Russian radar went dead every time the Israelis were attacking Syria and Iranian targets in Syria, which may be the case. That may have been the quid pro quo that we got from Russia in return for not helping the Ukrainians. Obviously, we could have been a very big help to the Ukrainians before the war. Now, much less so, or maybe now again we could be, but before during the war, we were using everything we could produce for ourselves, so we didn't have any spare production capabilities in any case. So that's more or less, morality versus interests. I previously had said strongly that I thought we should have gotten involved in the civil war in Syria against Assad. We didn't because of interests. I mean, not because we were against Assad, but because we had to keep. We should have stopped the killing. We didn't because of interests, and I think there's a question of morality versus interest, and of course, we who complain about what the world did or didn't do during World War II have no right then after we don't act when we can act, and so I think that's the problem in and of itself. But let's hope the war somehow comes to an end and not by Ukraine having to give up because Trump forces them to. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks. Anyone else? Okay. If there's nobody else, I will wish you all 2 weeks. We will get together even if this war comes to an end in the next 2 weeks, because we'll have to talk about how it came to an end, hopefully. I'm optimistic. I got to be optimistic. You got to be realistic too. I mean, I wouldn't put all my money on an agreement coming in the next week or 2 weeks, but more so than any other time, I think we can be optimistic. I think there's no chance. I think there's no question that we can do more. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone did answer the question. I was asked whether the ultra-Orthodox was sustainable. Economically, I don't think it's sustainable long term, but we'll have to see. I mean, that's why we have to pull some of them out of the ghetto, because it's really not sustainable long term. But we'll have to see. Okay. Once again, we'll speak to everybody in 2 weeks. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for being members or whatever. Please be subscribed. Anyone who's not a paid subscriber, please do so. I always appreciate paid subscribers. And they'll see you all in 2 weeks. Take care.